As we jump into kind of the beginning phases of Rails and just a little intro into what it does and how it does it and kind of what it is, you've probably noticed and probably remember that working through Sinatra, there was lots of duplicate code. Um, we, there was a ton of copy and pasting common parts from problem to problem. And that's what spawned Rails. So David Heinemeier Hansson is the guy who created it, affectionately known as DHH because he has a really hard name because he's from some Nordic country. But he's a creator of Rails, and he created it to solve his own problem. He loved solving difficult problems, but was really fed up with copying and pasting so much code because he just needed to do all this stuff just to get going. So he decided to go up a level in the abstraction. So, we went from Ruby to Sinatra, and now we're jumping into Rails. And all of the things that are really basic to a web app, running a web server and, having specific things work a certain way, were just abstracted with Rails. And it was like, okay, all these things are taken care of for you so that you can really concentrate on the problems that you're trying to solve with your web app, not the setup. So what this means, though, is that it does take a little bit to really start getting comfortable with Rails. There is very affectionately called Rails magic. And that's because we're not going to completely understand what's going on under the hood. We could attempt to. We can dive into the source code. It's out there. It's open source. But for a lot of times, we're just going to do it a specific way, and we're going to accept it and be okay with it and know that it works because we're doing it the Rails way. And that's okay. But by understanding what's going on underneath, because of the things that we've learned, we'll hopefully be okay with upping the abstraction. So let's dive into a little bit. Oh, and one other thing. So Sinatra is considered a DSL, a domain-specific language, and Rails is considered a framework. And the most succinct definition I've seen of what the difference between the two is, DSL can have its own concrete syntax, whereas a framework cannot have its own syntax since it is used in the same language in which it was created. I don't know if that really clears things up, but yeah. I don't think it matters too much to know the difference. I just wanted to mention that. Frameworks also are typically the entire scope of an app, or a web app. So you'll have the server and the routing and the all the way from the server part to what is shown in the browser is typically in a framework, as opposed to libraries. So when you get to React, React is a library, it's only handling one part of the puzzle. It's not, you can't run a React server. There isn't such a thing. So a React doesn't have a server. I guess that's better phrased. So Rails is a web application development framework written in Ruby. And it makes assumptions about what every developer needs to get started. And it allows us to write less code while accomplishing more than many other languages and frameworks. And that is why Rails is so widely used, especially in the startup world. You get a lot done very quickly with very little code. And then as you mature, you just continue extending your app, and yeah, Rails does its thing. So, or I guess as your app matures, you just keep extending it because it is super powerful. But one of the main reasons that people pick it is because you can get up and running very, very quickly with a full stack app. Rails is very, very opinionated. So it can be very frustrating at times. If you try to do things not the Rails way, you will become very, very frustrated. When you choose to use Rails, you choose to abide by the Rails conventions and the way that it wants things done. And some people love this because it means less decisions, like we were talking about before, the idea of Rails, less of the there's a Rails doctrine, and it's convention over configuration. So doing things a certain way instead of setting everything up. So it's kind of, you abstract away the setup and you just do things a certain way and it works. And with that, Rails also makes the assumption that there is a quote unquote best way to do things. And it's designed that way. So designed in ways to encourage that, what it believes is best, and to sometimes discourage other ways. So if you dive into and go all in on learning the quote unquote Rails way, you'll find that it becomes very, very productive. And you'll probably find that you start disliking other ways of doing things, and that's fine. But you're going to be less happy if you try and do things that you've learned other places, if you have any reference from learning things other places. One of the reasons that Rails is taught is because it is so opinionated. It's forcing a lot of very good habits on people, as long as you embrace it, and you need to embrace it. So the Rails philosophy, and we're going to get into the code in just a second, is two major guiding principles with Rails. Don't repeat yourself. So being dry, and that I think is taught all over the place. And then convention over configuration, like we said. So Rails has opinions about the best ways to do many things in a web application and defaults to this set of conventions, rather than require that you specify minutia through endless configuration files. The configuration files are there, but we don't need to touch them ever. So to create a new Rails project, and there are a couple of things that you'll need on your system. If you're running local, you'll need, of course, Ruby, and then you'll need Rails. And Rails is a gem. So I already have it installed, but if I didn't, I would do gem install. Oh, I have a RVM issue that I don't ever spend the time to try and fix. Okay, so that fixes that. Gem install Rails. I'll probably get a more updated version at this point in time. Yeah, so 5.1.5. I probably didn't have that version. And you'll know what version you have if you type Rails -- version into your terminal. I'll tell you. Oh, I scrolled up. You also want to have SQLite 3 on your box. And you can type SQLite 3 -- version. And it's quite the string that it gave me back, but that's what Rails uses by default for all the databases and things. So that's why we want to make sure that we have that. So let's start a new Rails app. So the command is going to be Rails new. And let's say blog. We'll go with a blog example. We're going to see it creates a whole bunch of files for us. Then it even runs bundle install for us. I can scroll up some and see everything that's going on. So Rails is creating a Rails project. And it even did a git init. It turned it into a git for version control. It's building, and then it runs bundled install. So it's getting all the gems needed and making sure they're up to date. Then it does this other run. Not sure what that one does, but it looks like it's adding things to the rake and to bin Rails. And now we have a Rails app. It's up and running. So I'm actually going to open that folder here to get rid of some extra stuff on our file tree. All right, so now we're in our app. Cool. I have to do that. Every new terminal. Okay. So here's our app. And I'm just going to go through some of the files that we get in and folders that we get. And if you don't know all the terminology yet, don't worry. It'll come in time. We're not going to dive into everything that Rails has, but just a general overview. So we have an app folder. Our app folder is going to contain our controllers, our models, our views, our helpers, mailers, channels, jobs, and assets of our application. And this is where we focus on for most of our Rails work in the app folder. The bin folder contains the Rails script that starts our app and can contain other scripts we use to set up, update, deploy, or run our application. Sometimes there's other stuff in here. We see there's some scripts in here that could run. Config is where we configure our application's routes, database, and more. So we see stuff like a database file, and that has some database things in there. We have SQLite by default. That's why we wanted to make sure we had that. And then a development database, test database, a production database. We can change these around as needed. Some other environment variables and Puma, which is the web server running, and our routes and things. Our DB folder. Or I guess let's jump here because we just did config. The config.ru is our rack configuration. And it's what we need for our rack-based servers, which is what Rails comes with by default, and used to start our application, run Rails application. So now to our DB. This contains our database schema, as well as the database migrations. Then we have our lib folder. Our lib folder is extended modules of our application. This is typically where we put things, libraries and things that are external that, well, we kind of get into, there's lib and vendor, and they kind of do, I think, the same thing sometimes. But we don't work with lib or vendor too much. But lib is extended modules for our application. Log is our log files. Public is the only folder that will be seen by the world as is. And this contains static files and compiled assets. So we see we have a static 404 page here and 422, and I don't even, the change you wanted was rejected. I don't think I've ever seen a 422 page before. 500, etc. We have our test folder, and that contains our test files. So our unit tests, our fixtures, any other test apparatus that we might have. We see it stubbed out a whole bunch of just some basic folders based on our structure of our app to keep our tests in order. We have our temp folder, which is temporary files, so cache and stuff. The vendor folder, which is a place for, this is the supposed to be place for all of our third-party code. In a typical Rails app, this would include our vendor gems. Git ignore file. This tells Git which files to ignore, not to put into version control. We did the config root, the gem file, and gem file lock. And the gem file is going to tell us what the gem dependencies are needed for our Rails application. So these files are used by the bundler gem to install all the extra dependencies that we have. Gem file lock is going to tell us the exact versions of all of those files that are installed. So if I set up a project and, this, let's go to something, this Selenium WebDriver, Ruby zip is at 1.3 because Selenium WebDriver might still be 3.11, but this Ruby zip might be 1.3. When you download this project and install it, it'll make sure that it sticks to 1.3 type of thing. So that just gives specific versions to a more granular level than the gem file does. This package JSON is something that's newer in these Rails applications, and this is for JavaScript things. So this is to initialize it as a JavaScript project as well for Node modules and things. Node can't work without this package JSON. We won't worry about this at all in the Rails curriculum just yet. This is a much newer addition to the Rails ecosystem. We talked about the rake file, then a README, which is our, well, we didn't talk about the rake file. We talked about the config. The rake file, this locates and loads tasks that can be run from the command line. So the task definitions are defined throughout the components of Rails. Rather than changing the rake file, you should add your own tasks by adding files to the lib/task directory of the application. So this would be a better place to add them than changing the rake file, because this is like what Rails is doing. And you see, it tells us this right here in the comment. And it will automatically be available through rake if you add them there. And the README being brief instruction for the application or whatever we choose to put in it. So we have a Rails, and let's get something going. So to get started, I'll type Rails server. Actually, let's type bin Rails server. Let's see what happens. So we see booting Puma, Rails 5.15 application starting in development, run Rails server-h for more startup options, Puma starting in single mode, version, code name, love song, min threads 5, max threads 5, environment development, listening on. So when we take this and pop that into our browser, boom, yay, you're on Rails. We got Rails running. It tells us the Rails version, our Ruby version, and just like that, we have a Rails app that has all the pieces connected to run its own server and render stuff to a browser window. It's all working. And we typed one command so far. And all that is wired together, which is awesome. Okay. Now, to stop the server in your terminal, you type Control-C, and it said that, but you might miss it. Use Control-C to stop. A popular pattern, if you're just getting going with Rails, is to open another terminal so that you can do rake tasks, you can do migrations, you can do those types of things in a different window and leave your server running, which is quite okay. Just remember that and kill it when you need to. Goodbye, exiting. Okay. So the welcome aboard page that we saw is kind of the what's called, or what can be defined as a smoke test, quote unquote. It makes sure that everything's working well enough to serve a page, but it isn't really, anything that we've done so far. So let's do our standard hello world page and see how everything connects together. So we need to create at a minimum a controller and a view. So a controller's purpose is to receive specific requests for the application. Excuse me. Routing decides which controller receives which requests. And often there is more than one route to each controller. And different routes can be served by different actions. And each action's purpose is to collect information to provide it to a view. So really, the controllers and the routes work very closely together, and they kind of sit in the middle so that when a user is on a web page, they say, okay, I want, the hello web site, web page, and that request gets sent back from the browser, and it hits the controller, and the controller says, oh, this is what the route tells it which controller it's going to, and it hits the controller and then says, okay, this is the page that we need. And the controller routes that, or the controller sends it off and gets data and sends it back. And the controller kind of sits in the middle. And that's the model view controller pattern, where the controller kind of sits in the middle and routes the data back. Well, route is a bad word because there's routes in Rails, but controls things. The data flow and is sending data back and forth between the front end and the back end. So it kind of sits in the middle as the director. Now, a view's purpose is to display the information in a human readable format. It's the web page that we see. That is the view. And an important distinction to make is that it is the controller, not the view, where information is collected. The view just displays the information. So by default, view templates are written in a language called ERB, which stands for Embedded Ruby, which is processed by the request cycle in Rails before being sent to the user. So it's written in a language called Embedded Ruby. So you can use Ruby and HTML in your views. And then Rails is going to process that so that it's sent just as HTML to the front end, to the browser. So Rails comes with a bunch of generators, which are super useful and helpful. And just like our Rails new command created all these files for us, we can use Rails generators to create controllers, models. Let's look at what Rails generator. Yeah, no, I didn't spell that right. Let's see, Rails. Did I spell that right? Let's see. That's been, oh, Rails generate should work. There we go. Okay. And you don't have to. We saw that when I did the first command, I did bin Rails. And you should be able to just do Rails, type the command Rails, and it'll work as long as you are in your Rails application. So Rails generate will give you a list of everything that you can do with a Rails generator. So usage, Rails generate generator, arguments, options. Here are our general options: help, pretend, force, skip, quiet, and please choose a generator below. It tells you all the generators that you can use. And I do this all the time. The Rails command line interface is awesome. And if you type something, and we'll see this, it'll continue to give you more information. So you can also shorthand this to Rails G, which is probably why I forgot that it was generate instead of generator. So let's say Rails G, and we want to build a controller. So let's say controller. And like, I know it needs arguments and options, but I'm not sure which ones. So we have Rails controller. I'm not even going to do -h or -- help. I'm just going to type Rails controller, Rails G controller. And look, it gives me all the info because it's like, oh, you only know this far. You only know up to the controller keyword. Let me tell you everything else that you need to know if you want to generate a controller. So it tells us all of the options. So now we know we need a name. It says action, and options. So it even throws in description. It tells you that this stubs out a new controller and its views. Pass the controller name, either camel cased or underscored, and a list of views as arguments. To create a controller within a module, specify the controller name as a path. This generates a controller class in app/controllers and invokes helper, template engine, assets, and test framework generators. It's going to do a whole bunch of stuff for us. Then it gives us an example. It says Rails generate controller credit cards, open, debit, credit, close. And it shows us what the URLs are going to look like. It's creating these actions. So the actions are going to be, you can think of actions kind of like, typically they're routed to the same URL, the same URI path. So if we had an open action, it's probably going to be /open. And we see we have debit here, so it would be /debit. So let's go ahead and continue with this blog example and say Rails G controller welcome and with an index. Let's see the files that are created for us. Sweet. Okay. So this has created several files and a route for us. We see it created this welcome controller Ruby file. It created a route. It invoked ERB and created some views, a views folder, and then an index. It created a test, a stubbed out test. It created a helper folder or helper file. It created some CoffeeScript for us and some style sheets for us as well. Something that you'll want to do as you work through the Rails curriculum is, and I don't think it is in here, there's a flag that you want to use with your generators because we at Flatiron are going to provide tests. So we don't want to generate more tests. That will be counterproductive. So what we'll do as we use generators throughout Rails is do Rails G. Let's build another one of these, just controller. And let's say, we'll just call this one goodbye. We can say index. And then we'll do dash dash, no dash test dash framework. And when we run this generator, we'll see it skipped this test unit. We don't see this being created this time. We get the views and then we jump right to helper. So you'll probably forget that a few times. I definitely did. And there are reminders in the curriculum, so don't think you have to write this down. But you will forget because I definitely did. Or maybe you won't. It'd be awesome if you didn't and you didn't get stuck on a lab trying to figure out why it doesn't work and why it doesn't pass tests when you created a test that isn't passing yourself. So yeah. The most important of these two files being the view and the controller. And the route. Route's pretty important too, but the actual files that are created, the controller and the view, the two that we've talked about. So let's go to this view, this welcome view. We'll just work with the welcome. We won't mess with this one that I just created. And let's go, so like we said, most of the things we're going to be doing in these applications, Rails apps, are in the app folder. I guess I need to bring this down some because we're going to edit code just a touch. So we'll go to app, and then we'll go to views, and it's going to be laid out by controller. We'll see that a lot of this stuff is just parallel. So we have a welcome controller and a goodbye controller. We just built those. So the welcome controller correlates with welcome. And this is where we have convention over configuration. If there's a welcome controller here, Rails is automatically going to look in this views folder, in the welcome folder, for the views for this welcome controller. I just moved that back. App. There. Okay. So Rails is automatically going to, let's collapse those down, connect this to this. And that's something that makes Rails very easy to work with, but also one of the reasons why we have to follow the Rails way. So let's go to, here's our view. Let's change this up from just this little welcome and let's say our hello world example. And that's saved. Now, right now, we can see all of our available routes in our application. And we do that by typing rake routes. Rake routes is one that you will get very comfortable using. When we type that, it can show us all of our routes. So don't worry right now about the prefix over here, that's for a different time, or really the verb. But we see we have a pattern, goodbye, and that's telling us the index that's going to be used, and then it tells us the controller and the action associated with it. So if we went to \goodbye, Rails is going to use the goodbye controller and the index method inside that controller. But right now, what we want to do is we want to set the home page. So when we go to localhost 3000, we want to see something there other than that Yay Rails page. So to do that, we're going to look at our routes. And routes is what is defining this right here. This is basically just, rake routes is just reading the routes file and saying, this is what we got. So routes is under config routes. Let me see, we have 2 routes right now. I'm just going to get rid of this one because that was kind of just an extra example. So right in here, every Rails app has something called a route. And the route is going to be what we do with just that home route, that \, when we go just to localhost 3000. And with that, we can just take this right here, put it there, and that's going to tell, actually like that. That is going to tell Rails to go to the welcome controller, to the index method, and to do what it needs to do from there. So this is going to map the request to the root of the application, to the welcome controller's index action, and get the welcome index file. And that's because this is connected already to the welcome controller index file. Well, no, this has nothing to do with this. Sorry. This is going to go to the index, and then the index through Rails is going to know that if it's in the welcome controller, it's going to go to the views, to the welcome folder, to the index, and return that to our page. And we should see that. So let's fire up our server again, Rails server. Rails S is shorthand for server. And then, yeah, let's look. We can refresh this page. There's our hello world. So we see that the whole Rails app is functioning. And we've dived a little bit into controllers, a little bit into routing, a little bit into views. So now that we've seen that, we've got a little bit of time. Still got good time. Let's actually pause for a second. How's everybody doing? Good? Cool. So yeah, let's dive into something. We'll just see how far we get. I think everything is kind of good as an intro to see really commonly used things as well as what is going on. So I'm going to turn off the server and let's look at this thing for collapse and folders, just to keep things tidy. Cool. Let's create a resource and see what that does in our routes. So a resource is the term used by Rails for a collection of similar objects, such as, articles, people, animals, and we can typically do these create, read, update, and destroy items for a resource, and that's referred to affectionately as the CRUD operations: create, read, update, and destroy. Or I like to say delete, but I guess destroy is the more accurate one of those two. Rails realized that, if I'm going to have to make one of these, a get, a post, another get, another get, another get, a patch, a put, a delete, a get, all of those HTTP verbs, like we had to do in Sinatra, that becomes very repetitive for, the typical application. If you have a lot of different objects, you're doing that all over the place. So it provides us a resources method, which is awesome. So we can do something like resources. And this is to declare a standard REST resource. So in our blog idea, we can have articles. And we give that articles. So this is a method. So this is a Ruby method defined somewhere. We're just calling it. If that makes it look a little bit more like a method. But Rails is interpreting this for us. So now, with that one line, with those two words, we see when we rake routes, a whole bunch of URI patterns and controller actions. Now, it did not create these controller actions. The resources only is doing routing for us. We're only in our routes. So it is ready, willing, and able to take all of these routes, articles, articles/new, articles/id/edit, articles/id, and all these different HTTP verbs, get, post, gets for these, patch, put, deletes for these, and send them off to the right place, route them to the right controller in action to have work done. Okay, moving forward. So yeah, now, like we were saying, let's look and see what happens if we try and go to one of these routes. Backslash, what is it? Articles. Routing error. Uninitialized constant articles controller. Something cool about Rails 2 is we get this right here, which is a console for us when we get errors. So if we wanted to, we hit an error, we could play around with everything that's available right here, right now in the code and see what's going on. Or we should be able to. Let's see, rake routes. Name error. Action dispatch. Maybe not. Clear. I know this console is useful, but I never really use it that often. Either way, there is this integrated console that you can do things with. There might be something missing, but either way. Back to our editor. So this error occurs because the route needs to have the controller defined. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new console, new terminal. And Rails G for generate controller articles. Now let's look at our controller. We didn't define anything this time. So we go to articles, we just get a class, a Ruby class. And that's all that it is. It's simply a class that is defined and it inherits from the application controller. And that inherits from action controller, which is part of Rails. So inside here is where we'll define the methods that will become the actions for our controller. And these actions will perform the CRUD operations on the articles inside the system that we're building. Now, in Ruby, there are 3 types of methods. As a side note, public, private, and protected. Public, we typically don't have to say anything about. Only public methods can be actions for controllers. So you can't have a private, like, index method. That's not going to do anything. Well, it's going to do something, but you can't use that for a route. So now if we look at this, we get a new error, unknown action. That's saying, hey, the controller's there, but there isn't an action for me. So let's generate that. Let's actually go to new, \new, instead of the index. So if we do an action, create the method, an action is just the method. Let's see what we get now. Okay. New error. Sort of like working with tests. New error means progress. So this error now is telling us that Rails expects plain actions like this one to have views associated with them to display their information. With no view available, Rails is raising an error. And we see, where are we at? Articles controller new is missing a template for this request format and variant. This would normally respond with no content and empty white screen. Since you're loading it in a web browser, we assume that you expect it to actually render a template, not nothing. So we're showing an error to be extra clear. If you expect 204 no content, carry on. That's what you'll get from an XHR or API request. Give it a shot. So once again, Rails being, like it says, extra clear, giving us a very useful error message. And yeah, so let's go ahead and create something for this to render. So we go to our views, following the convention. Since we are in the articles controller, we go to the articles folder. And let's create a new file. I'll call it new.html. And here, let's start using this embedded Ruby. So we call it .erb. Now, the way Rails is going to interpret this is it's going to move from the outside in. And I'll explain what I mean by that, and hopefully it'll make sense. If not, let me know. So we're going to be able to write embedded Ruby in this view, but we're also going to be able to write HTML. Rails is going to interpret our embedded Ruby and create HTML with it. So it's going to take our embedded Ruby and evaluate it and generate HTML and then return the HTML page altogether just as HTML. So you can use other languages and compile them back too, although it's not really recommended to have a whole bunch of them stacked up. But it is something that is possible. And I think if you switch them, you get issues. I've never tried. But the first extension is the format, and the second extension is the handler. And maybe you can't chain them. I don't know. I thought you could. And the handler will be used to render the template. So Rails is going to use the HTML, and the default handler for HTML is ERB. And Rails will use other handlers for other formats. Builder is the handler used to build XML templates, and the coffee handler uses CoffeeScript to build JavaScript templates. But right now, this is what we're doing with HTML. And you can, okay, yeah. I'm gaining deeper understanding of these things as we go from the notes. You can add different handlers. So I worked with an app that was written in Slim. So it was new.html.slim, and Slim was a gem, and we wrote things in Slim. And it was similar to ERB, but different. So let's put something on this page. Go back and refresh. Refresh. And there we go, new article. Any questions? I think that might be a good place to pause as a good intro. So we've seen, let's recap. We've seen generating a new Rails application through Rails new. We've seen the Rails command line interface. And if we just type Rails, we should get everything. Yep. It's telling us everything that we can do in Rails. Rails new, Rails generate, destroy, DB console, console runner, server, test version, etc. The most common Rails commands are, it even tells you the most common ones. And we've looked at how the controllers and the views are connected. We didn't look at the model part much, but that's fine. That's where a lot more of the logic goes when that time comes. We looked at what all of these folders and even some of the app folders are used for, and what some of these files are about quickly, or not quickly, briefly. We created a couple views and a couple controllers to see how they're wired together. We stepped through the error messages that come from not having all the pieces put together. We looked at our routes some and learned how we have these resources, this resources method available to us, and also this route method available to us to set up our application. This right here, guides.rubyonrails.org/routing, is super useful. Really, the Rails guides, this right here is amazing. One of the benefits of something like Rails being as mature, being around as long as it has, what, 14 years now, if not 15, is that the documentation is amazing, in my opinion, compared to everything. It's everything that you could want and need, but not overly bearing. And some of these are really large pages, but they have nice little chapters set up. And one of the things that I really enjoy is that everything has examples, and they're very clear, straightforward examples. They're not super ambiguous. It's not like I'm wondering, what would I use that for learning Rails? They're not super advanced. They're very straightforward, to the point, small snippets of what things are. So you'll end up spending a lot of time in Rails guides, which is good. But yeah, that's part of it. We saw how Rails comes with a server, and we can just start it up and go out of the box. What else? We saw rake routes some. Something else you can do with rake routes, just a little tip, is if you throw the pipe after rake routes and grep. Grep is like a filter, basically. And you can type in a word or part of a word. It'll only return things that match that. So you see it highlighted in red, article, even though we know that there's this welcome and this root, didn't show it. So if you have, 5 or 6 resources, that's going to stack up really quickly. And if you want to look up something or search for something, grep is kind of how you search for routes. We saw the generators. We used the controller generator. We talked a little bit about the requirements, Ruby, Rails gem, SQLite 3 gem. Just those three, really. And then everything else happens for us once we install Rails or run Rails new. And yeah, talked a little bit about what a framework is versus a domain-specific language, some of the differences, some of the thoughts behind Rails and why it was created, and how to best use Rails in the Rails kind of ecosystem of, convention over configuration. If you are let me see. If you're really interested in kind of the Rails way and thinking that way, Rails Doctrine is rubyonrails.org/doctrine. It's kind of long, but if you're really wanting to go down the Rails rabbit hole and be the best Rails developer you can, understanding that is going to make you a much better Rails developer, why things are done the way they are. Yeah. Questions? All right. Well, if there's no questions, then thank you very much.